a fight for freedom. The small schedule of our plans for today: we will have Mykola Povoroznik online, the first deputy head of Kyiv Civil State Administration, and we will talk about the consequences of the strikes committed by Russians on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. At 13:30, we will have Valery Kovalevsky, representative of Foreign Affairs in the United Transition Cabinet of Belarus, along with Tatiana Martynova, representative of civil society in Ukraine, and we will talk about the political situation in Belarus. We will talk about Lukashenko regime and his support of Russia in the war against Ukraine. At 1500, we will have Alexander Khorunzhy, press officer of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, and we will talk about the consequences of the most recent strikes of the Russians on our territory. And now we're having Denis Maslov and Olena Khomenko, deputies of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and members of the Servant of People faction, and we'll talk about the attempts we undertake to get to the Olenivka penal colony and the attempts by the ICRC to exercise control of the conditions of the prisoners of war in Olenivka. Mr. Denis, Ms. Olena, please. Good morning, dear colleagues. Yesterday, a delegation, including the plenipotentiary on the human rights, arrived to the meeting station coordinated earlier on the 13th of October during the meeting of Peoples of Deputy ambassadors of the G7 with Andriy Yermak and the representatives of the ICRC. As you know, the ultimatum was submitted during that meeting for the Red Cross to arrive within the 3 days and to prepare the mission to visit the Ukrainian prisoners of war in Olenivka. People's Deputy and the Commissioner arrived there to establish their presence, their preparedness and the support, and that we can accompany the Red Cross so they could accomplish their mission. Unfortunately, the representatives of the Red Cross did not arrive and the mission did not take place. Starting from May, starting from the point that we know that there was a strike on the place of detention of our prisoners of war with many victims. Since then, ICRC did not visit the detention station and did not accomplish their mission. They appealed to the Russia's failure to provide security and safety guarantees. We understand that, but now, given the situation of armed aggression of Russia against Ukraine, all the international organizations have to undertake more efforts. They have to do more. They have to reform it and don't hide themselves behind the protocols and bureaucracy and procedures and processes, etc. People's Deputies, Office of the President of Ukraine, and Andriy Yermak in particular do everything possible to liberate our prisoners of war and to inspect the conditions of their detention and disclose the horror of this situation to the world. As you know, the session of Parliamentary Assembly or European Council was over yesterday, and the resolution was adopted on the further escalation by Russian Federation. And the resolution includes provisions for the international organizations and representatives of the European Council member states to enable them to join such missions. Also, during the session, there was a side event where the representatives were invited of the prisoners of war liberated from Azovstal, and they had meeting with the representatives of Parliamentary Assembly of European Council. During which they were witnessing. They gave information about what was happening in the colony, about the conditions of detention. We have the support of the Office of the President, but we also seek the support of the international organizations. They have to undertake more effort and to do more than they did. Thank you. Mr. Denis, excuse me. First, I wanted to say a couple of words. First of all, I want to thank my colleague, and indeed, for today, many of our prisoners of war, including civilians, including civilian hostages, are imprisoned by Russia. They are all subject to the norms of international humanitarian law. Thus, any threatenings, any tortures, and the conditions of detention have to be inspected, in particular by ICRC. This is absolutely within their mandate. We demand the International Committee of Red Cross to fulfill these legal obligations. We demand that Red Cross visit Olenivka and other places of detention of our prisoners of war and civil hostages in all the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine, as well as in the places in Russia, in Russian Federation, where our prisoners of war are kept, along with the civil hostages. This demand was declared during the meeting of the representatives of our enforcement agencies, Office of President and Andriy Yermak, with the representatives of international organization. It was said that we will expect the representatives of the ICRC. We will wait for them in the division line within the 3 days. Unfortunately, yesterday we were there, but the representatives of the ICRC did not show up. Instead, meanwhile, it's their direct legal obligation, and we want to emphasize that. We've seen certain changes in public rhetorics. For example, previously, ICRC, talking about the war in Ukraine, they were mentioning a conflict. I want you to understand that there is no such a category. It's not a term of the International Red Cross Committee mandate and international humanitarian law. We're talking about the international armed conflict, and we have to understand the essence of it. Because in this case, we're talking exactly about the Russian aggression against Ukraine. After that meeting, ICRC started calling it an international conflict. Also, just a few days ago, ICRC publicly announced that they are ready to bring their representatives, and they have representatives in the Donetsk region who potentially could visit the places of detention of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages. Still, they don't have some permits, and without mentioning who does not provide such a permission. And we know exactly who does not provide such permission. It's Russian Federation, which is the direct violation of international humanitarian law. However, ICRC still avoids mentioning that it's Russian Federation who does not provide such a permission. They mentioned that they don't have access to all the prisoners of wars in that region in the conflict. And I have to mention that our ombudsman was talking about this yesterday, emphasizing that Ukraine, on its part, provides the access for ICRC to the Russian prisoners of war kept in Ukraine, fully compliant with the international humanitarian law. We do this on our part, and I think it's necessary not to hide behind the protocol standards and the rest, but we have to talk directly and openly that Russian Federation keeps ignoring the norms of international humanitarian law, so that we get an option of pushing the international organizations and to exercise pressure on Russian Federation to fulfill their obligations. What we demand from ICRC is that they fulfill the monitoring mission over all the camps of detention of our prisoners of wars and civilian hostages, so that they come there personally as envisaged by Geneva Conventions. They had personal, confidential conversations with our prisoners of wars and civilian hostages. To witness the facts of torture and unhuman attitude, because we know directly from the people who were liberated, who were exchanged, that the tortures and violent practices are very widespread in the places of detention of our prisoners of wars and civilian hostages. We demand the ICRC to exercise their obligations, including setting up communication between our prisoners of wars and their families. We should also improve their psychological condition, feeling this connection with the families, and we demand the ICRC to hand over the medicines, humanitarian aid, clothes, meals to our prisoners of wars and civilian hostages, which were earlier prepared by Ukrainian side long ago. For those people, for the prisoners of wars and civilian hostages, because it's the direct obligation, according to the Geneva Convention, is the direct obligation of the ICRC. That's why we have a right to demand it from them, and we have a right to demand ICRC to publicly announce who impedes the fulfillment of these obligations. As soon as ICRC finally comes back to its mission for which it was created more than 150 years ago, and when they stop hiding behind bureaucracy and piles of paper, I'm sure that our joint pressure with the international institutions, the countries that support us, we will be able to provide access for the ICRC to our prisoners of war and civilian hostages. This is utterly important, and this is a #1 priority, because we're talking about the life and health of our people. We're talking about their survival and future liberation. We want to declare that we will take all the possible efforts and impossible as well to liberate all of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages so they come back to their families, to their homes. And we cannot afford any compromises. It's our firm position. Thank you. Dear deputies, let's talk a little bit about the mechanism of realization of this mission. Which steps should be taken by the ICRC so that they can get to Olenivka and other places of detention of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages? Specifically, which are the steps to be taken? You know the exact steps. We have certain procedures in place, but as we see, the procedures are not enough. The specific steps, they depend on the aspirations of the organization, depending on how much they aspire to reach their goal, depending on what connections do they have. They have their direct contacts with Russian Federation. They have options of coming there. They can come and talk to the specific people in there. When, so to say, when there is a goal, and the tools, the instruments should not be limited in achievement of this goal. They have to define the way of how they do it. They can do it, and they do it. The only question is, maybe now it's not enough effort being taken. And as my colleague mentioned, we will not permit any compromise. We will require them to take all possible mechanisms, tools, contacts, do everything so that Russia Federation can provide security guarantees for this mission. May I comment as well? You know, I think that what I said, the times they require changes, and including changes within the structure of ICRC. The Geneva Conventions do not impede the ICRC openly and publicly calling those who impede the fulfillment of their obligation. The longer the ICRC will hide behind bureaucracy and bureaucratic wordings without saying directly that it's Russian Federation who impedes the access to our prisoners of war, there will be no movements, and we will have the same situation we're having within the last 8 months. I think, and it's my personal opinion, that ICRC should come out with more open and public position, which will not let Russian Federation further to be hiding and to hide the crimes against our prisoners of war and civilian hostages. Do we understand it correctly that the only way of realizing this mission is with the help of the ICRC, because there are no other mechanism known to international community within historical practice? I will answer this way. If we will not be able to exercise this mission through ICRC, we will seek accomplishment of this mission through other international organizations and the supporting states. It was clearly articulated, but yes, the broadest mandate, according to Geneva Convention, is wielded by ICRC. But it will not stop us, because we will do everything we can to improve the condition of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages and to liberate them eventually. Dear colleagues, your questions, Ukrainian Forum, the representatives of ICRC made an announcement that their representatives are ready to come to Olenivka, but they don't have a permit or permission from Ukraine. Can they do it without the permission from Russian Federation? do they want it, or are they just afraid for their lives? Because the armed conflict can envisage that different situation may arise, even provided the permission is given. Yes, you are right. The different situation may arise, and ICRC, they act within certain mandate. Yeah, yes, they declare that they cannot exercise this mission because there is no confirmation of the security guarantees from Russian Federation. But you know, the international organizations, some of them, for example, the Parliamentary Assembly of European Council, they already start stepping beyond their limits. For example, in the resolution on the further escalation of armed warfare by Russian Federation, for the first time we've seen in this resolution such wordings as terroristic regime, as calling for the international tribunal to be created, call to provide the anti-aircraft systems to Ukraine. It's not a security organization. The Council of Europe is not a security organization. They stand on 3 pillars. It's democracy and human rights. They do something new, and the international organizations, they should revise their approaches. They should step beyond the framework and do more. For example, the representatives of IAEA, they managed to get to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So can the ICRC to take that example of IAEA and go to Olenivka? We think that yes, ICRC can step beyond their procedures within which they act for the time being. May I also compliment a little bit? Very strict and open position. What we're talking about now, come back to roots, to what you were created for. Don't hide behind the rules and procedures. What was our proposition, our demand of our delegation on the meeting of our delegation guided by Andrei Yermak, the head of the presidential office? Ukraine created all the conditions. ICRC can go with us or without us. The people's deputies were ready to go to Olenivka, with the representatives of mass media, so that the whole world sees that in that case Russian Federation would not be able to hide those violations of the rules of international law. They won't be able to hide the facts of impeding ICRC to get to the places of detention of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages. That's why they have to act publicly. I understand that there is a principle of confidentiality in the activity of ICRC, but it refers to communication between the sides, but it in no way impedes ICRC with its active position and its demand to get the access to the places of detention of our people, so that ICRC disclose to the whole world the information about who impedes this access. We've all seen the commentaries of our prisoners of war who commented that there was no single case of visits of the representatives of ICRC during their detention. Do I understand it corrected? That there was no single case of the visit of the representatives of ICRC of visiting our prisoners of war. So is it the case that there was no single visit? Is it true? Those of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages who were liberated, with whom we had communication, and it was emphasized on the yesterday's meeting. That's true. They did not have themselves visited, and that they don't have any knowledge of such visits by the representatives of ICRC to the places of detention. Yes, there is no such information, and why it's important. Please understand that when the representatives of the International Committee of Red Cross do not show up to the places of detention of our prisoners of wars and civilian hostages, it unties the hands of the Russian Federation to exercise tortures there and exercise inhumane attitude to these people, which further leads to the hope of our people to be fading. If the representatives of the ICRC show up there on the regular basis, and the representatives of Russian Federation know that there is a monitoring mission going on, that they have an option of confidential communication with our prisoners of wars, it may serve as the preventive actions so that these tortures don't exist. The administration of such place of detention know, and our prisoners know, that if ICRC comes from time to time, they have an opportunity of telling truth to them. Thank you for joining us, Olena Khomenko and Denis Maslov, People's Deputies from Sluga Narodu, Servant of the People Parliamentary Fraction. On the next briefing, we will talk about the consequences of strikes on the capital.